Okay, hey guys, I'm Pallavi, and I'm here to kind of give an overview and a revision of everything we've done in CCC so far so that you feel a little more confident in attempting the CCC quiz that's been uploaded. And also, hopefully, that you can come back to this video and revise when you need to brush up on your concepts to start attempting your final assessments that are going to be in this. There is no exam, it's a project based thing, but it still does help to kind of have an overview of everything that's been done so far. So I have made a deck for this, but I will also be sharing a link to the deck in the description. You can also feel free to ask your questions either on, I think the Zyka group would be the best place to ask your question. You can at me and I'll reply. I suggest asking on the group because I think that way a lot of people's doubts get solved instead of just your doubt if you DM me. So it kind of helps, in that mutual learning process. But yes, enough talking. Let's get into the deck and let's finish off all the topics that are part of CCC. So here we go. Okay, let's revise CCC. The very first topic we dive into is macro culture. Macro culture, according to Pooja ma'am, like her interpretation of our current macro culture is that it's a very non-binary world. We live in a very pluralistic society. People are very diverse. Options are very diverse. Your choices are not between yes and no anymore. It's not between black and white anymore. There is so much nuance now because of just how many people have a voice that you cannot make things black and white. So that was her interpretation of our macro culture right now. But really, to understand macro culture, you have to think of it as a global kind of agreement or a consensus on what our values are or what shapes us, no matter what our smaller cultural groups are. So no matter whatever your smaller groups are, for example, you may be living in Bombay, so you might identify as a Mumbaiker. You may be a woman, so you may identify as a female. Like all of these things are your smaller cultural groups that you identify with or you move in, those social circles that you move in. But macro culture is so overwhelming and so almost dominant that no matter where you are in the world, to a certain extent, it still affects you. For example, no one in the world would deny today that the internet is almost a non-negotiable right. It is a, and there is, that is why there is discussion also currently of making internet access a human right. There's a discussion of it in the UN, and that is because we've come so far as like a planet really where internet is unlivable. Like we need to have it to live, we can't live without it. But yeah, it's a shared global cultural narrative that shapes us no matter what our cultural groups are. There is a way to understand how it comes to be and what are the forces that push and create the macro culture. Arjun Appadurai's Global Cultural Flow, which you can see on screen, really does a great job at understanding what are the bigger systems that affect this overarching system. So let's just actually go to the table that defines all of them. There is ethnoscapes, which is about flows of people. So like, where do people want to travel? You may have heard of, you might have seen these, in fact, viral videos on YouTube about the power of passports. And some of the most powerful passports in the world are the ones that allow you to travel to the most number of countries. I believe the US passport is one of the most powerful. I'm not entirely sure on which one it is, but how you can travel, where you can travel, where do people want to travel, what kinds of travelers exist, what kind of travel methods exist, all of these things, these ethnoscapes, the movement of people frames and shapes our macro culture. For example, Europe still being seen as such a big tourist destination. It is one of the top places that people name when they say, oh yeah, I want to travel, Europe. That is a defining factor in how we view our macro culture as a whole. um, Technoscapes is flows of technology. For example, how are people sharing their advancements in tech? Satellites, outsourced production of tech gadgets, like your production, which is something we discuss later as well. In where are things produced? Why is China manufacturing Apple devices? Why does it say designed in California, manufactured in China? These are questions that, when you think about it, helps you arrive at what our macro culture is. Financescape, flows of money, stuff like stock exchange, even within a country or on a global scale. Foreign investment, lately Bitcoin, NFTs, all these kinds of things determine flow of money. And when you observe these, you can also come to a better understanding at what shapes our macro culture. Then is mediascapes, flow of information, entertainment, art and culture, content. You may have read about how Japan does a great job at improving their soft power. And a lot of their soft power comes from this mediascapes aspect of macro culture. Japan's entertainment industry, and in fact now South Korea's entertainment industry as well, is taking over the world. Like they have an incredible amount of influence globally in terms of who consumes their content. For example, the Indian Mahabharat TV show may not be consumed all over the world, but Death Note is being consumed all over the world. BTS is being listened to all over the world. And those flows of information, when you observe them, again, help you arrive at what macro culture really is. And finally, ideascapes, flows of ideas, ideas of human rights, climate change, terrorism, beauty, sexuality, lifestyles, aspiration. One example, again, you may have heard of is Eurocentric beauty features or European beauty features, and that is considered the beauty standard, which is why even people from different ethnicities who have almost completely different features, from within those cultural groups, people who imitate the Eurocentric beauty standards the best are still considered the most beautiful. And that's because there is this kind of cultural hegemony of the European beauty standard all over the world. There's a reason Paris and French women are like considered a beauty ideal, because we have a global history now of white supremacy. We have a global history of colonization, and that shaped our beauty ideas. And therefore, in the current scenario, we consider the Eurocentric beauty standard to be the most common beauty standard. Of course, that is changing a little. Korea is really getting their, they're getting their thing in the glass skin and the Korean treatments, and the fact that they're the plastic surgery capital of the world. So yeah, basically think of all of these as like circulatory systems that are running underneath, and all of them shape and create an overlap and work towards creating what the macro culture is. And because these are constantly moving, the macro culture is also constantly moving. So that's just an explanation of what macro culture is and what ethnoscape, like what the escapes are that kind of determine that. Let's go micro. We've had an overall look at it, looked at the bigger picture. Let's zoom in now. A group's culture is its shared values, religious practices, beliefs, rituals, traditions, art, symbols, which basically can be encapsulated as the way of life or the way of life that they practice. If you go through Pooja ma'am's deck or the video, you will see that for each of these like points that I have listed, she's given a detailed example. So if you're not grasping why one of these should be included as part of our culture, I would say go through that deck. That should help you understand. But what you need to arrive at is that a group's culture is the way of life that it practices. And the way of life encompasses the core principles and ideals that shape a cultural group's view of the world. For example, if a lot of your culture is about patriotism, for example, India is a very patriotic country. We really value our unity as a country, our diversity as a country. At least this is, I'm sure there are debates about that, but we do consider ourselves a patriotic people. We really value our country, and that reflects in the way we interact with the rest of the world. For example, our conflict with Pakistan, the way it is framed in our media, that framing caters to our way of life and our view of the world. And so when you understand what people consider their way of life and what people consider their culture, you can understand how to cater to them, and you can understand how they interact with the world. That's really the point of going micro and analyzing what a people's culture is. Let's move on. Okay, value, practices, or norms and beliefs. I know some people are confused about this. I know that there is a question about this in the paper that confused a bunch of people, but it's really simple. I'm going to explain it once, and I'm going to use an example Pooja ma'am used because frankly, she's a genius. This is the best example I could have thought of. First and foremost, what is a value? It is a guiding principle. It can be a lot more abstract. It doesn't have to be very direct. Okay, like it is generally abstract. In fact, values are, because they're more overarching, and they kind of affect the rest of the things that fall under it, like practices and norms and beliefs. So they're a much wider scope in terms of what they affect. But yeah, it's a shared guiding principle that people use to govern how they live their lives. Now, the example that Pooja ma'am has given in the deck is that Indians, for example, have a low tolerance for uncertainty and unplanned futures. We have a strong sense of anxiety about not knowing what's going to happen. And ergo, we try to control outcomes as much as possible. We try to ensure that our future is as meticulously planned as possible. And we don't take risks. We're a very risk-averse people. So that's a value. That's an understanding of what is like this abstract idea that kind of pushes people to make the decisions they make. Now we're coming to the decisions that people make, which is practices and norms. This is a behavior that stems from both values and beliefs that we hold as a society. So, for example, like we discussed earlier, we don't like uncertain futures. If I'm learning music, there is a good chance that I may not have a career because it's a hard industry. And so my parent is more likely to say, oh, do an MBA, do your engineering, and then you'll be fine. Like you're sorted because you won't have to worry. And that actually lets you understand what a belief is, because when the value is translated into what people do, the belief that is created in people's mind is that there are certain degrees that will guarantee my child a job, and then they will not have to worry about instability. And so those beliefs are tenets or convictions that people hold to be true. So I hope you've kind of understood the difference between these. I would say try to work from a value or try to work from a practice backwards if you want to really understand it. Pick any practice that you see in and around you and try to work backwards from that. That this practice is being caused because of what belief? What do people believe that is making this practice happen? And then this belief stems from what value system? I think that's a good exercise to do to kind of really understand the difference between these three, if this example wasn't illustrative enough. Let's move on. Okay, hi, I somehow missed this, so I'm going to include this in the middle of the video, but we missed dimensions of difference. I'll just take you guys through that as well. Share screen. There we go. Okay, lovely. Present. Nice. So these are the 6 main dimensions of difference that kind of determine what our like cultural practices are and how we deal with them, how our norms, values, beliefs are shaped. Okay, let's just get into them. These can be looked at as sliding scales for different cultures. Power distance is how willing are we to have concentration of power in certain people's hands. So for example, a culture that doesn't mind like a lot of power being held in the hands of a few is likelier to like have dictatorships because they're more okay with that, whereas a more democratic country would insist on having less concentration on power or less concentration of power in the hands of a few. So that's basically power distance. It's also how we solve problems in society. Are we a flatter society? Like, do we have less power distance from each other? Are like conversations with extremely powerful people unattainable? Or does everyone kind of have similar level of power and communication when it comes to solving problems? Then there's uncertainty avoidance. We already discussed this a little bit in the example of students wanting to take up MBAs or students wanting to take up certain degrees because there is a understanding that you will have a job guaranteed at the end of it. Individualism versus collectivism. Just to illustrate this example, individualism, America is viewed as a very individualistic society. Personal freedom is viewed over the collective good. Hence, you see so much anti-masking and personal freedom and gun right laws really being a hot topic of conversation constantly in America, because to them, the individual choice of not wanting to wear a mask and not wanting to infringe on your personal freedom and wanting to own a gun despite how dangerous it can be is more important to them than the health of the collective. Whereas in India, I mean, largely you could say that we are a collectivistic culture, at least in how we practice our social behaviors, like how our weddings are. They're considered not a affair between the two people who are getting married, but a whole set of families coming together. And there's a sense of community. It's very community driven weddings in the country. But actually, a better example, since I went with the COVID example for individualism, would be to look at China. They're a very collectivistic society, and China has been using face masks from the start. Like, it is considered common courtesy to wear a face mask at all times. So, there's the difference really. Masculinity versus femininity, related to the division of emotional roles between women and men. This also is a lot about just who kind of has access to what in society. And so who has financial superiority over the other? Who's the one calling the shots in the homes? And therefore, what kind of, because who has the power determines what society is structured like, you can figure out what the culture is within that country or city or whatever. For example, we live in a patriarchal societies, most people do, around the globe. There are certain matriarchal or matrilineal societies in the country itself. I believe the Nayars, I'm not sure, I'm trying to recall from my sociology classes. I believe they have a there is a specific tribe that has a matrilineal society and a matriarchal society where the women call the shots. So, again, kind of about power. Long term versus short term orientation is interesting in that it shows where your priorities lie as a culture. Cultures that have a very long term orientation are willing to put in the effort to put in sustainable development goals. They're actively working towards them today itself because they're looking at things in the long term and they're realizing that in 10 years, we're not going to be able to sustain the kind of production we have. Whereas short term countries that are trying to just like only look at the moment, are less likely to work towards sustainability, because for them economic sustainability right now is more important to them. Paying off the coal companies that are currently working in and around the country is more important to them than ensuring that we don't need to rely on coal at all in 10 years. So that short term long term orientation, what you prioritize and what you hold important, that is kind of the difference between that. Indulgence versus restraint is about kind of hedonism, really. That do you value the fact that people are allowed to enjoy themselves, or value the fact that people get to like spend time on their own, or do you value restraint and not opulence? So in Japan, you would see that they have a very restrained culture. Overworking is considered glorious, and like you're not supposed to be very ostentatious in how you have your wealth. But indulgence cultures like America, you will see incredible displays of wealth. Like the entire Trump legacy, in fact, is just a display of the American indulgence. So yeah, those are basically dimensions of difference. It's a sliding scale for all different cultures. Pujam had linked a very interesting website that links different countries and the kind of sliding scale they are on for each of these. I would say check that out. Let's move on to the rest of the video. Cultural practices. Okay, this is going to be quite important for the upcoming bits. So I would say make sure you understand this quite clearly. They are patterns of social interaction and behavior. Think of it as the application of the knowledge that you have of your cultural values and norms. So you understand that as a culture, you value religion, you value discipline, you value all these things. A practice is when you apply it. So again, we discussed this something similar earlier, where a belief affects your norms and practices. It's the exact same thing, but now we're going backwards. We're going from the practice reflects or is an application of the norms and values that you have as a society. They are the most easily observable parts. In 2 to 3 of the PPTs now at this point by Pooja ma'am, there is an iceberg. And right at the top, you can see cultural practices, and everything else like values and perceptions and all those much tougher to nail down things are at the bottom. They're below the ice. You can't see them directly. The benefit of cultural practices is that they are the most easily observable, and therefore they're the easiest to use to arrive at the deeper conclusions that are below the water in the iceberg. And so if you observe enough practices for a long enough time, you can draw fairly reasonable conclusions about what the cultural values and beliefs are. I would recommend going through the cultural practices deck just to understand the different types of examples that ma'am has spoken about, because frankly, that is just the best way to understand this. The more examples you go through, the better you'll be able to grasp this. Let's move on. Reading culture. Okay. Reading culture is a way to kind of understand what people's culture is. And this here we dive into how to read culture. So observing and exploring the norms, practices, behaviors to arrive at the unobservable parts of culture. Like I said before, the lower part of the iceberg helps you arrive at the perceptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs that people hold. So I've just brought an illustrative example here that I don't think Pooja ma'am has used yet. I wanted to show some different examples in case you all weren't understanding her examples. So vada pav in Mumbai, on the surface level, it's like, oh, okay, it's a Mumbai snack. Like we love it, it's great, it's tasty, it's spicy, Indians like spice. That is very surface level observation. But when you really sit with the vada pav and you observe the vada pav stall and you go to the Andheri station, a lot more begins to strike you, and you understand that vada pav as a snack, the way it's been designed, the way it is used, and what it means for people is a lot more than just nutrition. It means, for example, in Mumbai, we've been told it's the city that never sleeps, and it truly does not. I am a proud Mumbaiker, and I will tell you that we're moving at all times. Vada pav is great because you need one hand to eat it. It's not messy. You don't always need chutney because the chutney can be put inside directly. You get it nearby transit locations. So like, in fact, some of the best vada pav in Mumbai, you will get near stations. Go to a train station and you'll get the best vada pav. They are easily wrapped in newspaper. They stay hot for a long time because the bun does a great job at kind of preserving that heat. And they also are less likely to upset your stomach because they're not a cold food. They've been cooked in hot oil. So most like germs, bacteria is kind of destroyed. So there's less likelihood that you'll fall ill after eating it. And it's fast to eat and it's nutrient dense. All of these things, when you kind of read, okay, how has this food been designed, why do people like it so much, you come to understand and arrive back at the conclusion that Bombay is a city that values its productivity and convenience and efficiency. We want food that is quick, that won't make my stomach upset, that is located conveniently, that is delicious, that is fresh, and that also lets me get on the train with one hand while also holding food in my other hand. Again, there are a lot of objects that you can analyze in this way, and we'll come to object analysis later. But that is the point of reading culture. You kind of look a lot deeper into something to understand what it means for a society. Cultural shifts, they happen in two big ways. One is a big shift due to a big change. This happens in a much shorter time span. I'm sure I don't need to give an example for this. The COVID-19 crisis radically changed our culture in a matter of months, which is like, things have only ever happened like that in these kind of scenarios before in the world, where a volcano explodes, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, like those level of events, nuclear level events, generally cause big shifts in small timelines. Then there is a big shift due to incremental changes and longer timelines. So a big shift, in example of what our expectation is for communication, I expect a response in minimum 10 minutes from somebody. And that change in attitude and like belief has come from years and years of communication technology changing. It went from you have to wait a week for your letter to arrive, or even before that, you have to stand on top of a mountain and see smoke signals. That is my first form of communication. I need to wait for a letter to arrive. I need to go to the neighbor's telephone to make a telephone call. I need to wait until my Nokia brick is like fully charged to call you. If you don't text me back right now immediately on WhatsApp, you're not my friend anymore. So like our expectations of what communication time is has had a big shift, but it's happened over a long time and it's happened due to incremental changes. I hope that example kind of illustrates what the second type of cultural shift is. Most important part is mapping cultural shifts. And this is one of the first frameworks that we came across. Keep in mind that this is not a surface level framework, but it doesn't really help you effectively prove anything. What it really does is kind of it's just an overview of society at the moment. It doesn't help you deep dive into the meaning of an object and what it means to people. It's kind of just like a temperature check. But yeah, residual culture is culture that has been around for a while and in fact perhaps is even ancient, and it may see revivals in the recent times. So for example, one example of residual culture currently in our just fashion industry is the corset that came from medieval Europe, I believe, and then it got revived in the early 2000s, and now it's again gotten revived in the late 2000s, not late 2000s, late 2020s, in the in the you get me, in the 2020s. But yeah, and that's actually because Y2K became popular again in 2020 2021. We picked up Paris Hilton's styles again after 20 years, which is a much shorter fashion cycle. And I can share some videos on that if you all are interested, on how the fashion cycle is reducing into like not even months, but days. Like trends die out in weeks. But yeah, the corset trend is a good example to see how really old culture has kind of prevailed and still exists within our society. Then there is dominant culture, the culture that has been dictated by the hegemony or like is the overwhelmingly popular culture at the time. It reflects the norms and moods of today. And when you are going to do any kind of cultural analysis of your consumers, these are the responses you are going to get. The dominant culture is largely reflected in your consumer analysis. Whenever you are go out and start doing like attitude perception checks, you are going to get dominant culture from them, because that is the zeitgeist, that is the thing that is happening at the moment. So I have written three words here: Swiggy, Urban Club, Amazon. What do they really indicate for our culture? To me, at least, and you may differ on this, they indicate a culture that values convenience. In today's time, I cannot wait for more than an hour for my food. I want prime day delivery on the same day. And I want someone to come to my house and clean my house because I don't want to clean my house. And I'm willing to shell out for these things. If I have disposable income, I'm willing to pay for convenience, and I'm willing to pay for my impatience. So to me, that reflects a culture that values convenience over all else. A more conservative culture that wants to save its money or is trying to be austere or practice austerity may believe that this is laziness, but we don't call it laziness, we call it convenience. And so the way you look at it is a bit different. I hope that example illustrated dominant culture. Emergent is new ideas and executions, tomorrow's dominance values, ideas that are kind of beginning to build, and you can see the undercurrents of it. Often emergent cultural shifts are initially viewed as subaltern or alternative or like punk almost, because they're going to become popular later, but right now they're really not mainstream. So it's like how EDM at the start of when EDM started, it was considered a sub genre of music, and almost all of today's music is influenced by EDM. All of today's pop music, which is the dominant music now, has heavy EDM influences, like the drop, the fact that we don't go into a chorus, but we go into a synthetic drop sound. That was an emergent culture some 10-15 years ago, when Skrillex and all were like kind of pioneering the genre. And now today, the music drop is something you will find even in Selena Gomez's music, and from no angle would you call her an EDM artist. So often a good way to spot emergent cultures is look at subaltern cultures, look at cultures that are considered punk or considered alternative right now, because often those become mainstream later. But yeah, you're engineering new meanings. Another good example which I have written here is observing Gen Z. And Gen Z are your consumers of tomorrow, right? Millennials now are like in their 30s. Gen Z are the ones, the oldest of Gen Z. Like, I believe a good number of us are actually Gen Z. We're the oldest Gen Z around, who are 22, 23. We generally are perceived to have a strong um, social justice need. Like, we want brands to genuinely make a difference in the world, and we refuse to support brands that go against our values. And this is something that has changed from how generations before used to do that. Generations before, like, I don't care if they're polluting a river, I need to get my stuff done. Gen Z, because they have so many options at hand, can have discretion to say, I don't want to use your product, you didn't support Black Lives Matter, or I don't want to use your product, you're being funded by like anti-gay rights groups. So brands now suddenly have had to like cater to Gen Z and suddenly have a social conscience. So like now Maybelline is now, throughout the year, they may not talk about queer rights at all, but like at the start of Pride Month, they're like, hi, hey, like, hi guys, you want to buy my Pride lipstick? You know, that's the idea here, essentially, that brands have had to understand what are the emerging undercurrents, who is your emerging consumer, and cater to them so that you can continue making money. Anyways, I got really salty there at the end. Let's go on. Cultural objects, we've already done this. Most of us have done this assignment. If you didn't, I'm concerned for you. Please reach out to your coco. But yeah, objects are intricately interwoven into our lives. How we use them, how we design them, and what they mean to us, they reflect a lot of deeper meanings. Like, again, coming back to the convenience thing I said, for somebody who loves AirPods, it's like, oh yeah, this is just easy to use. On a deeper level, it means that you really value convenience. And so when you look at the use, design, and symbolism of an object, you can arrive at a lot of deeper conclusions about what a culture cares about and what they value and what their beliefs are. Also, since you're in the business of selling objects, understanding people's connections to their objects is very, very important for you, as we will realize when we are in marketing departments of our own. But yeah, let's move on. Okay, it's framework time, bestie. We already did one. We did the residual, dominant, and emerging. We have a couple others. I forgot to write the rest on this, but it's here. It's on the deck. Don't worry. Okay, first of all, cultural onion. This is fairly simple. It is, in fact, to me at least, the easiest. I find residual culture and all actually harder to do than the cultural onion. I think it's a great way to arrive at the core value that you want to arrive at. So, for example, you have symbols, which you start with symbols outwards, you go outwards and then inwards. That's the best way to go through it, because you're going from the most observable things to the least observable things. Stuff like pictures, objects, gestures, etc. These kind of things carry meaning. So, namaste, what does that mean for us as a culture? That is a symbol of our culture. So we include that in that. And it is a recognized, well recognized symbol. So again, those are things you need to keep in mind when you're looking at what are the symbols of a culture. And usually you will not do this for a culture at large. You will do it in a specific sphere of culture. So you might do it around education. So a symbol in education might be Zoom. What does it mean for you? What does it mean for people? For a lot of people, it is about accessibility. I'm able to access my class no matter where I am in the world. For other people, it is a sense of alienation, because they're like, I'm not seeing my classmates in person, and I'm not creating genuine bonds and not able to spend enough time with them. And so, there's a lot of different interpretations there, but there are a lot of symbols that are there. I'm going to continue with the education example, hopefully, here. Heroes. Your heroes are generally your professors, your RAs. They're the people who have characteristics that are highly prized in that education culture. So, for example, you may really put your professor on a pedestal because they're able to disseminate information to you in a way that really helps you. So, again, I want one clarification I want to make here in terms of heroes. I know when we think heroes, we immediately think, okay, good people. Heroes don't have to be good. Like in this cultural onion context, people don't have to be good to be your hero. Hero point is ki, I know the Indian definition of the word hero is ki a good protagonist. Heroes just means protagonist. It is value insensitive. We value what they do, but they need not be a good person to be a hero. So keep that in mind. Don't look for like morally good people when you're looking for your heroes. Look at the people who kind of symbolize or are emblematic of our culture at a moment. Like you could even say Beer Biceps is a hero currently in the business education section, because he does these podcasts on it. Some people really value what he does. Some of you may not like him as a person, but you cannot deny that what he embodies is, like, he does become a hero in, like, when it comes to education and business. Rituals and practices, behaviors, interactions, norms of behavior. So you're looking at more intangible practices now. What you do, how you interact with your environment, how you interact with other people within that culture. Those are things that you cover here. And all of this mehnat you did, symbols, heroes, rituals, and practices, is to arrive at a core value. Here's where you arrive at an essence of a culture, and you understand that all of these things that are interlinked and overlapping, what do they really mean for your culture? I would suggest, since we did this assignment in class, put your assignments in the WhatsApp groups with each other and look at it. Understand what different people have arrived at, because all of us were doing it in the same sphere of like young Indians and post-COVID world. But a lot of us came to very different conclusions. For example, my group came to the convenience conclusion. Another group came to the hedonistic conclusion. We value pleasure over all else. We value convenience and pleasure. And so different like groups of people, because they have different people in them, will have arrived at different ideas. And so it's a good idea to observe what other people have done. Let's move on. This is one of my favorites. I love this. Okay, anthrovision and ethnography, which is like the study of people. Understanding people in context is the point of anthrovision. You are ensuring that you are actually immersing yourself in a people's culture to understand them. You are not just taking things at random and kind of creating a culture from that. You are really spending time in understanding what people actually do and practice. So you're actually spending a little more time in that third ring inside the cultural onion in a more practical sense. But yeah, two really important terms here. First is ethnocentricity. All humans have a tendency of assuming that their culture is best, it is right, it is natural. Any deviation from that, especially from an outsider, is disgusting and bad. And there is often a sense of outrage at it. For example, Americans, when they see Indians eating with our hands, for them, cutlery is like natural, it's normal. What the hell? You don't eat with a spoon. For Indians, eating with hands is normal, and it's something that we do all the time. And so, because you have an ethnocentric kind of ideal, you will see Americans who will often judge Indians or like diaspora Indians for eating with their hands. And ethnocentricity often is the root cause of xenophobia, xenophobia, for people who don't know, is when you have a hatred, an irrational hatred for outsiders, be it your own culture or people from outside your country. When you're doing anthrovision, you have to discard your ethnocentricity. You have to understand that what may seem right to you is not necessarily the case for everyone else. Next is cultural relativism. It's the ability to understand a culture on its own terms and not make judgments using the standards of one's own culture. Essentially, abandon your ethnocentricity. have an objective view of what another culture is doing. For example, I don't know if a lot of you studied this, but in geography, there is a tribe we studied in like fifth or sixth grade called the Maasai tribe, and they drink cow blood. A lot of people in class, especially since we are a Hindu nation, we have a lot of Hindu people in class who really revere the cow and would never want to eat it. For them, it was like horrible. They were like, oh my God, these savages. Like there was a lot of that response. But you have to understand the cultural context that they are in, that cows are their main livelihood. When they consume cows, they do it as a way of respecting the animal as opposed to like degrading it. There's a strong sense of respect for their livestock. And that without that cultural context, you make bad judgments and you don't give time to the culture that you're trying to study. So always ensure that you understand cultural relativism when you're trying to grasp a new culture that's around you. How to use anthrovision? Ask people direct questions, but that may not always help you. Immerse yourself in the culture of the culture that you're trying to study, and spend a day in their shoes. There's also two ways of doing this. One of them is very involved. One of them is the one that most likely most people are going to do. First is emic, which is point of view member. You actually become a cult member or like whatever. Like one example is a cult member. If you'd like to, I'd say watch Midsommar to understand the difference between, okay, this is, I'm going a little bit off the rails, but what the protagonist does, Florence Pugh's character Danny, what she does is she kind of becomes a point of view member. She actually indulges in their rituals in Midsommar. She does the ritual crying thing, she takes the drugs, etc., etc. And Etik is the character played by Chidi from The Good Place. I don't remember the actor's name, I'm really sorry. But yeah, he comes in as an outsider and he positions himself as an outsider even when he's at the, Midsommar cult. And that eventually leads to his death, which is not the point. But I'm trying to make a difference between these two there. What is the difference between being a point of view member and observing and analyzing from the outside? Let's move on. No Midsommar tangents. Okay, this is the final thing. Circuit of Culture is the last framework that we've done. It is an additional layer to the use, design, symbolism framework we did a little earlier for object analysis. So first is production and regulation, which is the same thing as design. How is it made? Where does it come from? You deep dive into these questions and list all the information you have. Then you go to consumption. How is it used? How do people interact with it? What is it actually used for? That is consumption. How often is it used? These are also questions that are important. Representation, which is the symbol part of the earlier analysis, is what does it symbolize? What does it communicate? What kind of lifestyle does it show? That's representation. And finally, that object that you're looking at, when people use it, how does it help them define who they are as members of a cultural group? How does it help their identity? When you map out all these things, when you find out information about all four of these things, you arrive at a distilled cultural code. That cultural code can help you guide making a lot of decisions you make in a business, or even just understanding your consumers and what they value. To give you an example, I used to work at an agency, and one of my clients was a real estate company. And we actually did something like this to arrive really at what people want. And selling real estate in Mumbai is hard because everything is very expensive. But yeah, like we dived into why were people buying homes? How were they buying homes? Were people buying homes before they were constructed, after they were constructed? Were people willing to buy homes before they were constructed? Because you never know if the builder decides to not build the building, because that happens all the time in Bombay. How were people buying homes? When were they buying them? Were they buying them after getting married, before getting married? At what occasions were they buying them? Representation. What did a home symbolize? If I buy a home in Thane, if I buy a home in Pedder Road, two very different locations, two very different symbolizations of what I believe my lifestyle is. And finally, identity. Different kind of buildings that we sold had different kind of identities that we were catering to. We had the more premium Trump kind of buildings that were for people who viewed themselves as like CXOs. There are all these buildings in Lower Parel that were owned by the company that were positioned to people who saw themselves as leaders, who saw themselves as like high flying individuals. And there were a lot of homes in like Thane and Andheri that were sold that were completely different branding, even though it was the same brand. And the branding with those homes was that it was for people who viewed themselves as family, who viewed themselves as a unit, who loved the joint family system and loved the idea of all four families living on one floor. So When you grasp identity, you kind of arrive at a final cultural code of whoever you want to sell to, or just even if you want to observe people, and that helps you make decisions. So yeah, I hope that helped you. If you have any questions, again, drop it in the WhatsApp chat. I should be able to help you out there. I would prefer that you don't DM me, because I will get overwhelmed with the number of, like, I get overwhelmed when too many people DM me, and I think it's easier to like answer questions in front of everyone, because then everyone gets the answer if they had the same doubt, right? So yeah, thank you. Best of luck with the quiz. Don't worry, it is not graded. You'll be fine. I just hope this helped you revise. Bye.